Welcome to Heartland Security, Discovering and Cultivating Our Sane and Sacred Center. I'm your host, and our guests today are Joan Blades and Terry Patten. Joan Blades is co-founder of livingroomconversations.org, an open source effort to rebuild respectful discourse across ideological, cultural, and party lines while embracing our core shared values. She's also co-founder of Moms Rising and MoveOn.org. She's co-author of The Custom Fit Workplace, which was the winner of a Nautilus Book Award in 2011. And she's the author of The Motherhood Manifesto, which won the Ernesta Drinker Ballard Book Prize in 2007. She's a mediator and an attorney by training and inclination, or I'd say an attorney by training, a mediator by inclination. And she is a nature lover, an artist, and a true believer in the power of citizens and our need to rebuild respectful and civil discourse while embracing our shared values. Terry Patten is a philosopher. He's an author, activist, social entrepreneur, consultant, coach, and he's the author of a groundbreaking new book, A New Republic of the Heart, an Ethos for Revolutionaries. Now, as an author, he co-wrote the book Integral Life Practice with Ken Wilber, Adam Leonard, and Marco Morelli. And that book distills ancient and modern practices into a contemporary transformational lifestyle. He also authored 3 previous books and over 24 book chapters, magazine articles, and academic papers published in peer-reviewed journals. So I want to welcome both of you. Welcome, Joan. And welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Okay, we're all going to be unmuted very soon. Now, a little background. The purpose of this series on Heartland Security is to call forth and cultivate a community of the heart, something that reminds us of the virtues and values that we share in common beyond any kind of political divide. And there are 2 key principles that are at the foundation of the real American dream: united we stand, and e pluribus unum, out of many one. Our session today is about evolution and about how evolution calls forth both of those principles, the principle of unity of the people and also of e pluribus unum, each individual having equal value and as one expressing the sovereignty of we the people. Now, my colleague, Bruce Lipton, the cellular biologist, author of Biology of Belief, he and I co-authored Spontaneous Evolution. He says that the next phase of evolution is that we human beings recognize that we're cells in a larger superorganism called humanity, or as I prefer calling it, humankind, because I think human kindness is really the currency of this new organism. And right now, there seems to be a huge gap between this recognition of our destiny and where we seem to be today. The good news is that evolutionary biology actually gives us a clue about what evolution entails and how we get there. Every phase of evolution, from the single-cell organism becoming multi-cell organisms to multi-cell organisms becoming really huge multi-cell organisms like you and me, 30 to 50 trillion cellular community, each of us, involves 2 things: expanded awareness and expanded community. So as these cells gather together from single cell to multi-cell, from multi-cell to very complex multi-cell, in that process, they were able to share the awareness of all the collective cells, and that's what gives us our consciousness. And of course, the connection and the community between these cells, we are a community, and as we come to realize that we're cells in the same body, we'll begin to recognize that much of our behavior, our collective behavior, has been a form of autoimmune dysfunction, that we've been fighting other healthy cells. Anyway, so in this session, we're really going to talk about some very practical ways of turning the ideal into the real deal, because our 2 guests today each represent one of the key factors: awareness and community. In fact, they represent both of the factors, but the focus of their work really has to do with one of these two. Now, Terry Patten, who's written The New Republic of the Heart, in his book, which is really quite a work, offers what I would call a sobering and yet inspiring meta-story about where we are now and how we can possibly change course to create a happier and healthier future. And Joan Blades, as co-founder of Move On and more recently Living Room Conversations, offers the community connection because living room conversations really have to do with rehumanizing ourselves after what's been kind of a dehumanizing kinds of communications that have occurred between people who seem to be polarized by political or religious or cultural belief systems. So we're going to talk today, we're going to have a chance to look at how we can become more aware of this evolutionary reality that we are in. And then we're also going to become more aware of how we can communicate across lines and rehumanize people who we disagree with, and together come up with this common core of what it means to be human, and perhaps even project a vision for the future that encompasses more than the two sides, okay? So we're going to begin with Terry right now. So what I appreciate most about your book, The New Republic of the Heart, is that it's very blunt about where we are right now. There's no, the veils are lifted. They say that apocalypse means the lifting of the veils. The veils are lifted on where we are, and in a certain way, how we've gone into denial or despair. And this book is how to navigate that space that takes us away from the avoiding the issue through denial and the avoiding the issue through despair. And it tells us what we're up against, both from the natural world and from the unnatural world of human behavior and programming. And it points us to a possible future where we can thrive. Or as Swami would say, evolve from children of God to adults of good. Mm-hmm. So why don't we begin? Terry, tell us something about the book, including how this book came about and what you hope it'll do to help move us forward.
Well, the book begins really by confronting us with the severity of our ecological predicament. And our whole culture, everybody knows that there's global warming. Everybody knows that it's bad, that maybe we're too late. They've heard all of this, but the particulars are even grimmer, really, than we tend to cognize. The actual measurements of CO2 parts per million, the actual temperature readings are tracking significantly worse than what were formerly the worst case projections of the IPCC or the limits to growth, if we go back that far. So the to integrate this is psychologically and emotionally so challenging that there are a lot of internal factors that are obstacles to our dealing with our situation realistically, bringing some sort of intelligence and wisdom to making our collective decisions. We're seeing breakdowns in our own psychology, for one thing. There's a whole deadly cocktail of factors, from neurocognitive biases, socio-cultural capital eroded by our immersion in a virtual world, the hypnotic trance that brings about. There's kind of become a corruption even in the public dialogue space. So the way that fear and our own reflexes to pull away from what seems to crush the spirit, and our own instincts, if given a choice between hope and despair, I'm choosing hope every time. It's obviously to become too pessimistic is to participate in a way of thinking that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think it's all going to hell in a handbasket, we participate in a whole way of being that helps bring about what we're imagining. So there's a moral necessity to finding our way to hope, but the hope on the other side of a stark confrontation with these disorienting realities is really all that is going to be adequate. So I help us get into that reality and to look at the factors that are fragmenting us and that are also at work that are bringing about wholeness. You know, by the way, by no means does this darkness mean that I think in any way that our goose is cooked. It is so important for us to all recognize that nobody knows what the future will bring, and that the history of evolution is a history of miracle after miracle after miracle, that scientific progress is proceeding exponentially. That means that miracles are almost inevitable. So wonders await us, as well as awful floods and wildfires and killer heat waves and maybe even some desertification and mass migration. It's this amazing mix of factors that seem to be in the works, and some of them may be averted or transformed. So to find our way into a vital engagement that can actually co-create a different future and be a community of engagement requires profound dropping down, meeting one another. In a sense, we've all been given an impossible question by life, a koan, like a Japanese Zen riddle, like what is the sound of one hand clapping that just stops the mind? And how can we be true to all our values and bring health and wholeness to this whole situation is a riddle that is stopping us collectively, but we can't answer it as individuals. We can only answer this koan together. So if we take that to heart, it drops us down out of what we know into being much more interested in what we don't know, into shared inquiry, not the kind of conversation that's a contest of opinions and dominance, but a conversation that's a genuine investigation and a meeting of vulnerable hearts confronted with something that nobody has a fully adequate answer to. And from that place, something new can begin. So the rest of the book really is an exploration of how we can be that change together in deeper and richer ways.
You know, you mentioned the Zen koan, and what comes to mind is that classic about the man who falls off the cliff and he's hanging by a little branch, and the branch it's just breaking. And as he's contemplating his fate, he sees this ripe strawberry, and he picks the strawberry and eats it. So we're in the process, since we all seem to be smiling here, we're in the process of eating that strawberry. We're in the midst of this amazing adventure that is an evolutionary adventure. And as you said, it requires us to do something that we've never done before, and that's think like a species, think collectively. Joan, do you have any comments or something to add to this?
Oh, I have so many things I'm thinking based upon what Terry was saying, because I started doing living room conversations because I live in Berkeley. And my question back in 2005 was, why aren't conservatives concerned about climate change? And I had this wonderful opportunity to talk to people on the right and have very good conversations with them. And I've continued to have good conversations with people on the right, and honestly came to an understanding around 2008, 2009, that the ability to have a conversation specifically about climate change had diminished, and the boundaries between right and left has gotten more impenetrable. And that's why I co-founded Living Room Conversations. I learned a lot, and good relationships made it possible for me to work with conservative friends on things where we shared concern. And at the core of this is your human kindness piece. And when you give people the opportunity to connect to each other in a human way, by and large, they do it. And when that happens, everything changes, because we even hear each other differently once we're we care about each other. And that's the core of what living room conversations are. Is it's a very specific format where two friends with different viewpoints each invite two friends for a structured conversation where there have been certain conversation agreements, and then they go through these rounds and questions that it's never a debate. It's really a deep listening practice where by the end you are thinking, oh, I actually like them. And that was really interesting. They see things very differently than I do. But when you start to grasp, the goodness of these people, which, we're ascribing bad intent to people all the time these days. Mm-hmm. And that's damaging to our ability to work together.
It reminds me of the biblical quote, the Jesus quote, resist not evil. And what happens when people get polarized is they're pushing up against another side. And they perceive that side as evil. I mean, evil Hillary, evil Trump, et cetera, et cetera. And what happens when you don't do that is that you actually have the possibility of cultivating a common goodness that might not have been obvious at the beginning as we create disarmament. This is really disarmament. You can't have peace in the Middle East till you got peace in the Middle West. And that's really what you're doing, Joan. Terry, any reflection on that?
I am so glad that you've taken this as your focus, Joan. I'm touched by the fact that there are such profound divisions also even within the left, that in a way it may be that some of our most important conversations will have to take place among people who, our factions and the things that distinguish us from one another have us far more divided than people are on the right. The right is able to march in lockstep in a way we don't seem to be able to. Not as much. You're discovering. Well, the divisions on the left seem to be very important to me. So conversations between people involved in spiritual growth and people who are more focused on activism are key. Conversations between people who are spiritually inspired and people who are more scientifically atheistic in their dispositions. There are a lot of gaps there too.
Terry, I want to go back to one thing. How was it that you decided to write this particular book, and when did you begin this process?
Oh, well, I actually felt that a book like this was necessary almost 20 years ago and began to try to write it. But the depth of the synthesis just required me to live into it more. I had to become capable of writing the book that finally emerged. And that took a lot of maturing. I worked on the current draft for probably 3 years, but the roots of it go back to growing up in an intentional community that was spiritually founded and that was dedicated to being a witness for peace and brotherhood, kind of being raised to be an activist, and then discovering, your activism has to go deeper. Well, you better practice. Well, your practice has to express itself in the world and making a difference in people's lives. And each hand washes the other and deepens you and deepens you and deepens you. I think that what I sense is that we're all getting our draft notice and we're reporting to reporting for duty. There's the whatever it was we were preparing for, time has come and all hands on deck. And the kinds of conversations that need to proceed from there are conversations that can surprise us, where we don't just say what we've already thought and learned. Bringing people together across boundaries is so wonderful. I salute your leadership, and I'm inspired by it, Joan.
One of the things I appreciate about the book is that it attempts to integrate, and it does actually integrate, these two threads, the individual and the collective. What can we do as individuals? And of course it's relates to Ken Wilber's work on the quadrants and so on. Obviously, you've really considered every one of those quadrants in this, and how we our internal life individually and collectively and our external actions and so on collectively. I don't see that that's really been done in a lot of, I think this is one of the first attempts to really put that to work in the political domain. Does that make sense?
Right. Well, one of the things that we all must realize, those of us who've been practicing for a long time and have tried to bring goodness, truth, and beauty into life and active as volunteers and all the rest, have the tendency to imagine that we're on the right side of history and that we are part of the solution and it's only those other people who aren't. But if there's going to be a real inflection point and a transformational move, all of us are going to have to change. So there's some sort of gesture that each of us, no matter how fully actualized we already are going to have to make if the whole system is going to go through that kind of a transformative change. And this arrival of that sense of personal responsibility at a deeper level and an inquiry into it together, there are many different kinds of conversations that we need to have. Some of them are with people we agree with, where we find our way into a shared inquiry out of which we discover how to evolve our capacity for friendship, for community, for practice, so that our process of cultivating those qualities that enable us to show up effectively and meaningfully and make a real difference are grown by our relationships and conversations. To some degree, the era of personal spiritual practice and spiritual realization is yielding to something else. We kind of signed an IOU and we said, well, the problems we face can't be solved with the kind of consciousness that created them, so I'm going to change my consciousness. Okay, you've been changing your consciousness for a while. It's time to solve the problems now. We're the sell-by date.
Yeah.
And I think for us to arrive in that together and to recognize that on the other side of all these things we are afraid to feel, there's the potential for a so much more joyful and meaningful and engaged real existence. You know, ever since the beginning of evolution, people have been right next to life and death and discomfort and pain and suffering. And all the joys and wonders of all of human experience and spirituality and art and literature have all emerged out of that unbuffered existence. For a generation or two, we've kind of gotten the illusion that where you can push all that stuff away and live in a kind of insulated harmony. Well, we may be about to lose that, but what lies on the other side is not awfulness. It's real life. And in some ways, it's going to be an opportunity to bring forth all that's best in us. And I hope we can feel inspired and energized by that prospect rather than just closing off in fear.
That's a really good point. That's true. We have been, all four of us have been quite insulated, perhaps most people watching this right now. I want to turn to Joan for a minute. Joan, how did the living room conversations come about? What initiated that idea for you? And
the very rewarding conversations I had with a group called Reuniting America with people on the right caused me to wish that others could have the same experience. And as the founder of Move On, I think in terms of the grassroots. So the reason living room conversations are designed to be self-facilitated, so anyone that's ready to follow the ground rules and the structure can use them, is because they were designed to be massively reproducible. I believe that leadership has to have the foundation of the grassroots. And so we need to recreate a foundation that supports leaders that bring us together. The media and leaders have been focusing on our differences, and we need to take control and focus on what holds us together. We have some beautiful new conversations about peace building and the American creed, what are our shared values, and forgiveness that have just gone up. And we have over 60 conversations at Living Room Conversations. And it's an opportunity for people to have an adventure in their living room or their cafe or schools. They're happening in libraries. They're happening in all kinds of faith communities. And we're now doing them by video also, because we need to do relationship healing and building locally. But more and more people are aware that we really need to do this nationally too. This particular season politically has got more and more people saying, I don't want to talk with those people. And another group of us saying, oh, we better start talking, because this is a domestic peace initiative. And collectively, with a group called the Bridge Alliance, we're having a national week of conversations starting on Friday. We're all around this country. People are intentionally sitting down with others that have different viewpoints to really listen to each other. And it's funny how much we've forgotten how powerful listening is. It makes a human connection that's just vital. And then many things can happen from there. Now, sometimes you find common ground. Sometimes you find you have enough relationship that maybe you want to facilitate it. Next step. And, climate change was my opening issue. And the comment I've made at times is, look, if everyone in DC decided tomorrow climate was their top issue in leadership, who cares? Honestly, with the way they've dealt with healthcare, the way they deal with the budget, we need everyone's best ideas in the room. And we need to have that agility and creativity comes with working collaboratively. And that's what we need to create. And I think it really has to start with us. And so it's incredibly exciting that people are showing up locally and by video conference, because the technology got good enough in the last 2 years that we can have great conversations with people all across the country. And it's just 6 people at a time. It's very intimate. So by the time you're done, you've got a relationship with these people you didn't know, and you weren't really confident you'd like them, and all of a sudden you're going, oh, that person's really nice. I don't want to get to know them better.
That's why, in our in the political discourse that we've been having this past generation, or some might call degeneration, it really has been about looking at the other side shadow and focusing on the shadow. It's always very easy to see the other side shadow. And then when you actually are, I would use the word confronted with how decent most people are, there's something that has to shift. Your perception has to shift. How would you, is there something that you yourself described progressive? Is there something that you've learned from the conservative sensibilities that you go, wow, I hadn't thought of that, or that's something that I'm taking on myself?
Well, one of the interesting pieces is money in politics is an issue where progressives think that corporations and people with money are corrupting our politics. And I've discovered that a lot of people on the right think that government is extorting money from corporations and rich people. It's like, it's who are you going to blame? And I'm looking, I guess that does make sense too. So it's two sides of the coin. And so I feel like my understanding has actually been enriched substantially by having these conversations with people that see things differently. Jacob, my friend in Utah, when I first started talking to him, climate was not an issue on his list of concerns. And it became an issue on his list of concerns, first of all, because he cares about me. He cares about his friend Ben. And when you care about someone, you care some about the things they care about. But then we could talk further. And, I've come to understand that climate is the progressive end time story.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
And, we're seeing how our views of the world connect in really deep ways sometimes. And I've come to understand that one of his concerns as a religious conservative is about being marginalized.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just, a wonderful human being, and I don't want him marginalized. But that's the sort of thing you don't get until you have those connections. And so my life is richer because I have these wonderful friends, and friends on the right, they have some very different viewpoints on stuff. It's, they're the techno-optimists. I was listening to you, Terry, and going, oh, you're a techno-optimist too. Well, some of my conservative friends don't seem worried about climate the way I am, because we're going to figure it out. And, then there's others who are thinking about it as just a natural evolution of things. But, okay, maybe it is a risk. I can introduce that maybe there is a human risk factor to consider.
Yeah, I like to think of myself as a techno-agnostic.
Well, I think you did make a good point there, Terry, that people do that this is that not knowing is really a very strong place to come from, because if you don't know, I think we know our knowing is in our heads, and it has a lot to do with beliefs and perceptions that we mistake for reality. And then when we confront the cognitive dissonance of having somebody else who has a different belief system, who you have a heart-to-heart connection with. It's like that wonderful book from the 60s, The Three Christs of Ypsilanti. Have you ever seen that book? It was written by a psychiatrist who did his residency at Ypsilanti State Hospital in Michigan, and he had 3 inmates who all thought they were Jesus Christ. He said, I know, I'll put them together in a therapy group and see what happens. Kind of like to tell the truth, my name is Jesus Christ, on. And what happened was very, very interesting, because each of them had the one who was the most, the least well, the one who was the most isolated, just isolated himself further. The one who was kind of in the middle, who says, well, I kind of like these 2 other guys, but they can't be Jesus, I'm Jesus. It was a bit of cognitive dissonance. Well, the third one said, hey, maybe we're all Jesus Christ. So in a certain regard, when you have that that heart connection, and you stay in the space of not knowing, it's possible that you come up with a solution that you didn't have prior. So that's where I'd like to take this next session before we open it up to questions. Given the fact that we are in this, I think that Joan and Terry both agree that we are at this evolutionary turning point where the markers do seem rather serious, even if technology might save us. How do we take these 2 tools that we have, the awareness of, that we are at a crisis point, and also the awareness of evolution, that evolution is something that's emergent. It doesn't look like what we had before. Just like we don't look like sperm or egg. We look like something else. But what was required was for those 2 things to come together. So if we look at, how we look at the next period of time, how do we take these 2 tools of communication and expanded awareness, individual inquiry and collective conversation, how do we take that into something that's going to move the dial? So whoever wants to start, jump in.
Well, I'll jump in with when people show up and they speak to people that have very different viewpoints and start to have this relationship, then things do evolve in very positive ways. And my conservative partner, John, has a 5%, if 5% of the population can shift culture, can help us get it to a tipping point. So with Move On, the initial petition, it took a minute to sign it, really, and to write a 1-sentence, comment. Well, with this particular work, it's a much deeper investment of ourselves. But what's so gratifying about it is it deepens our relationships with others, with our friends, with new people, and with ourselves. The leader of our faith community work, I love the way she talks about how she keeps on discovering things about herself when she has these conversations. So fundamentally, my big hope is massive engagement to bring us, to really have us evolve to a point where we have a norm of respect and dignity for everyone. So that when that's not happening, people are appalled, say, oh, that is wrong. That there's, public censure, because we've been going the wrong way here. Mm-hmm. And we can create that if we show up for it, and we'll take care of each other. That's the other thing. When we are solving problems and we care about each other, then we'll look to meet everyone's basic needs. And that's, when things are tough, that's where we need to be as human beings, where we want to take care of each other.
Yeah, and actually, Terry and I were talking about this earlier, that we don't know for sure what's going to happen. Things do look grim, and we might be midwifing or we might be hospicing. And whether we're midwifing or we're hospicing, it requires the same care that you just described. So we can only go right doing that. And what occurs to me is that these conversations take us away from our diversion on hating the political leader of the other side and bring us to a much more real conversation. Terry?
I think our leaning in at is partly really acting on and understanding that we have received our draft notice and letting it catalyze us. It's hard to wake up enough from our consensus trance and the denial that pervades our country as a whole. So letting that awaken you can draw you beyond just facing dark realities into being energized as a participant who's reaching out in all kinds of new ways. And it's also about vulnerability. In some sense, it's a draft notice, and if it's a draft notice, you're reporting to the revolutionary cadre in the mountains, maybe. But in a way, you're reporting to the monastery, because it's about really being remade and being transformed and deepened. But in another sense, it's like reporting to the Betty Ford Center, because we're all addicts and we're all going to have. But of course, you arrive at the Betty Ford Center and there are no therapists and protocols. It's just us addicts, and we're going to have to remake ourselves together. So we need to have a conversation about how we're going to do that. And so I think that there are pretty rich living room conversations to be had on many different, not just across the red state, blue state divide, but across all kinds of, not only even across divides, but just even to deepen. All of us who think we agree with each other on the very deepest levels can discover new levels of coherence in our relationships. Because quite honestly, if we're going to meet the challenges of this time, the very nature of human friendship and of community will need to evolve. So agreement, opinions, agreements, disagreements, that's not even the level of it. It's got to do with a deeper level of human resonance, friendship, and brother sisterhood, really.
Yeah, and that's really what it's really all about. In order to metabolize the as Swami would call it, the residue of thousands of years of rule by dominate or be dominated, it requires that field of love and connection and caring. So it's okay to hear people's emotional despair, because that's there. That's part of the mix. I think that we can't slough over it and pretend that everything is okay. We're navigating that narrow passage On one side, we have denial. On the other side, we have despair, hope and despair. And, we're really looking at that middle ground. And from what I've heard from each of you, there's that human connection is what makes this new thing possible. It hasn't been done yet. The kind of community and communication that we're talking about hasn't really been tried until now.
Terry,
So, yeah, go ahead, Joan.
Terry was talking about, kind of the differences and how it's many differences. And I just want to expand upon that, because when we do a living room conversation, it's like age differences, cultural differences, political differences are just, almost a small part of it. If we're talking about how technology has changed our way of relating to each other, the right-left doesn't matter nearly so much as the age differences. That's where the big difference is in the way we communicate and have relationships. But what I really appreciate about these conversations is they cause us to be more thoughtful and self-reflective and intentional about our lives. Mm-hmm. And so it's a really enriching experience. And yes, it can be, there's a whole set of Me Too conversations. And those Me Too conversations can have more or less differences for intentional reasons. Because sometimes it's good for a group of women to get together, and sometimes it's good for a group of men, and sometimes you want the mix. And age makes a huge difference in all sorts of conversations in the way people relate.
So maybe it's we too, the we too movement, we all. Before we open it up to folks who are listening in, I want to make sure, particularly, Joan, that people know how to join the conversations this week that the Bridge Alliance and Living Room Conversations have launched. How can they get involved?
Well, if you go to livingroomconversations.org, on the front page, there's a set of conversations that are ready to have people sign up. And that's if you want to do video living room conversations. You can also just choose to have a conversation in your own living room in person with friends, or in your faith community or library. There's also events at the National Week of Conversation.
That's right.
Also up. So there's an abundance of opportunities to participate, and we'd love to have people participate however they'd like it the most.
Yeah, I've been involved with the Living Room Conversation here in my area for a few months, and it's been very wonderful and enlightening, particularly in having heart connections with people whose beliefs are pretty much different than mine, and yet the heart connection seems to be what is enduring, and where and in staying connected, we're able to find ways to accommodate one another in surprising ways. Before we open it up, Terry, do you have anything else to add about bringing this into the future, which is now, apparently?
Yeah. I think it's important for us to hold that this matter of meeting one another, as central as it is not the only thing that's going on right now. The other thing has to do with us discovering another octave of commitment, recognizing that this time, being the all hands on deck time that it is, needs to be able to mobilize us in a way that doesn't make us attenuated and shrill and just convicted of our current way of looking at things. Let us recognize that it's the all hands on deck moment and have that open us to new possibility, not so stuck in what we already know. That if we recognize it in those terms, then what's necessary now is a voice of a different kind of authority, where love finds an expression that is more naturally authoritative even than the most intimidating expressions of anger, where the voice that prevails expresses really what's best in us. And that means each of us evolving. It's a time for every practitioner to practice like crazy and become together something that we never have been. So that's, wow, that's our koan. Okay.
It's quite a calling too, and a koan. And I like that both of you have pointed to this next phase as an adventure. And I think that's such a wonderful reframe, such a wonderful reframe. You know, it goes back to Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, and now our entire species is in the hero and heroine's role. You know, we're in the movie as a collective, and that makes it exciting. And each of us has a significant part to play as we choose. So Barbara, can we now open it up to other people who are on the call who might have a question or comment?
Yeah, we have one hand up, and it's Mansour Vakili. I'm going to try to move Mansour onto our screen, and sometimes the rate of the internet connection can be problematic, but let's give it a try, and then he can ask his question or make his comment. Just take a minute here. Okay, he's coming on.
Ah.
Hi, Mansour.
Hello. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, everybody, for this important and very deep conversation. I was just wondering if we're talking about the perception change, and at the same time, destruction that human being is making to human network and also to other species and Earth and everything too. But the deeper question, philosophical question, is that is there a bigger picture that is playing us, or we are the one only playing this issue? Is it possible that we are living in a living system, which is self-organizing system, and is trying to self-organize us, and we are all blaming ourselves rather than understanding that it's giving us all kind of message to evolve to higher level of conscious and understanding? And this philosophical issue, I guess, is the main question that we need to first answer to that, and then get to, the conversation among human being network. Because what we are finding out that if this is a living system, the behavior of living system is different than our linear logic and science that we are applying to it. And fortunately, with all this destruction that we have done, we have created so much information as far as system theory, quantum mechanics, network theory, that is helping us to understand that this is a living system, we are not alone, and it was a purpose behind it, because we became self-aware, and through this self-awareness, actually the Earth as a living system was becoming self-aware. And that's where we are getting, but we are just focusing on what we are making as far as the destruction, and our focus on that, and then the conversation among us is just who is right, who is left, who is this type of questions is not getting us to the bottom of it, the root of the main problem, and seeing that how our linear mind that we develop through the process of self-awareness is just approximation of this living system. And this, but at the same time, same linear mind is being able to create this understanding of that how a system works, how we are getting to the chaotic zone to become self-organizing. And that's where human being is going right now. I'm sorry I'm talking too much about it, but this is what I think that we need to get more philosophical and more deeper questions, and through that we can have everything answered. Because if you look at the human being as a living system, I'm doing the most complicated things like talking with the minimum effort. The living universe does that too. We are just not aware of it. And when we accept that this is a living system, actually that that's consistent with the traditional beliefs that human being had, and also now with the new system theories and all the new nonlinear theories that we are.
Good. Let's take that up. That is really a really good point, Mansoor. And that is that, you know, we are part of this larger system, this larger Gaia, so to speak. You know, anyone want to make a comment or about that before I?
Well, I often talk about living room conversations being part of a growing ecosystem that's trying to heal these divides and create a more functional, caring communities. And, you know, I have insight about one very specific small piece. And I fundamentally am going on faith that if it's, you know, it's one day at a time, it's one step at a time. But this is one step that I have a great deal of faith in. That is one of the steps we need to take. And I hope to have it revealed.
Yeah. It's interesting, you know, the title of my book, A New Republic of the Heart, essentially refers to this self-organizing living system perspective. And the metaphor that I associate with it is that of the mycelium, which is the root system of mushrooms, which can proliferate for miles and miles, and it's remarkably intelligent. And yet it can just lie there dormant for years on end. And if the conditions aren't right, no mushrooms are blooming, but the mycelium is just there, latent. And there's a social mycelium. In a way, everything that is healthy in human relations is there. We give directions to strangers. There's a heart connection that naturally arises across these divided tribal loyalties. There's a kind of inherent goodness in human connection. And so that mycelium is there. And under these stressful conditions, human intelligence and wisdom are going to find a way to assert themselves. We're not just going to unconsciously slide into chaos and destruction. What is best in us is going to find its way to bloom when the conditions are right, and the conditions are ripening now. So I think that this reminder of the nonlinear dynamics and the living system dynamics is the context, and that obviously we as local cells in that larger body can only do what we can do and see what we can see, but we can appreciate that we are being orchestrated by something bigger, and we can trust that. A fundamental disposition of trust is the basis of any kind of sanity. We are trusting the process of our own lives, even if the process of our own lives might come to us bearing witness and offering care in the Grand Hospice Project. There will be beauty and meaning in whatever lies ahead. And yeah, we're going to die. That was always the case.
Yeah, it was always the case. and, you know, it's interesting what Mansoor brought up also beyond biology is physics, quantum physics. And when you start to unwrap and unravel quantum physics, things get very weird. And the whole and these concepts of time and the linearity of things as we perceive them, there's an entire world, kind of universe to be discovered beyond that. It took more than 150 years before Copernicus's ideas were incorporated into common wisdom, and it's been over 100 years since Einstein came out with his theory, and nearly 100 years since Max Planck, did his work on quantum mechanics, and we're still living in a Newtonian universe of equal and opposite forces fighting against one another. And what I find most encouraging about both your work, the Living Room Conversations, and then this new Republic of the Heart, is that we're moving beyond, we're emerging to something different beyond where we've been, that includes this this connection in an entirely new way. Is there anyone else, Barbara, who has something to ask or share?
No, it seems as if everyone's being very shy this evening. So I'm certain that the three of you can wrap this up in a very interesting way.
Okay, well, let's try for some final comments. Whoever wants to jump in first, Joan or Terry, who wants to make the first final comment?
I do have one more question that just popped up from Steve. Can I take that one right now?
Sure, why not?
Okay. It'll just take a minute for him to join us, hopefully, on the screen. Go ahead. Steve, are you there? Steve, are you here and would like to ask your question? Ah, the wonders of the ghosts of technology. Okay, we're gonna, and then I'm going to.
Universe, obviously. Okay, well, I'm sorry, Steve.
That's okay. But Ani has a question, and we have a little bit of time for it, so I'm going to promote her. Hi, Ani.
Hi. I wanted to ask specifically about small groups, the processing in small groups, because like Margaret Mead said, it's only in small groups that the world is changed. And I'm at Unity Church in Santa Barbara, wanting to launch a mission-centric small group ministry there. And I'm looking at the core group process by Barbara Marks Hubbard and Carolyn Anderson. And I'm wondering what you all know, what models you use that would be easy to apply to small group mission-centric circles.
Well, living room conversations are specifically small group. They're 6 people typically, because you don't want to get to 8, because then self-facilitated doesn't work so well and the intimacy diminishes. And 6 is a very nice number. Sometimes it's 5, but it is specifically to have a certain kind of conversation and have people listen to each other in a deeper way. And it can be internal for a faith community, or it can also be a way to be very intentional about inviting new people in, people that are missing from the conversation. And we have a whole faith communities sector up on the website if you want to read about that. And I'm not sure that's what you're looking for, but that is a piece that might be useful for what you're doing. And I hope it is. And if it is, let us know about it, because this is open source and we're counting on people to tell us what's happening and what's working. And open source means we're constantly learning and making it better, because the people that use it are causing us to learn and get better at what we do.
There's something I'd like to add too, Ani. In my book, A New Republic of the Heart, I talk about a whole family of experiments in small group work about the we space, that whenever even 2 people are together, there's what's happening for me, there's what's happening for you, but there's also something right in the middle between us, the we space itself. And becoming conscious of how that itself can evolve and practice and go into higher states. And there's a whole body of research. And in the book, I refer, there's a book called Cohering the Integral We Space. There are a variety of experiments. And, there's a whole field of dialogue, really, and a lot of rich resources that I hope you'll take a look at some of the specifics there. And in the book, one thing in particular is the principles of evolutionary dialogue in chapter, I think it is 9, that are unpacked, that describe ways really for us to go deeper with people with whom we have a lot of agreement, where it's not so much about bridging divides as it is about making use of what we, of the resonances that we do already have and deepening them.
You know, what's really interesting about all of this is that we're actually learning to take whatever I call it our work of heart. You know, we each individually, if we decide that there's something that we're up to, it's a work of heart. It's how we express our love in the world. And what's very powerful is to actually relate that to the larger picture. What I do every day, you know, whether you're a yoga teacher or you build houses, whatever it is, how that relates to being connected and woven into this new understanding of how we are all in it together. And Joan, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I think you've summed it up beautifully.
Okay, well, thank you. Just so everybody out there knows, I wish we had time to really read through all of the comments in the chat space. I'll see if we can access that afterward and somehow respond to that. I want to let everybody know that this is going to be available as a recording, free. It'll be available tomorrow night. Let's see, tomorrow at the AGNT site. So if you signed up for this and you want to watch it again, you'll be able to watch it that way. Am I right, Barbara? Is that correct?
Yes, everyone will receive a follow-up email, whether they attended live or are registered but were not able to attend tonight, and it'll give them an exact link to this recording. And I hope that you will share it because I think it's been very meaningful.
It's been wonderful being with all of you, and as I, again, we certainly didn't solve any problems, but maybe we've come up with some questions that will lead us in the right direction. So. Any final word of farewell, Cherry and Joan, before we close this session?
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and I hope this contributes to this reknitting of the social fabric that you've done so much beautiful leadership in focusing on, Joan. It's a privilege to be here with you.
Well, thank you both for having a wonderful conversation. Maybe we can do a conversation together someday soon. That would be fun.
Thank you, everybody, for being with us. This is Heartland Security. I'm Steve Bhaerman. Barbara Fields is our producer, and we'll see you next month on May 16th.